Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called nondual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. This episode is an introduction to the sacred scripture of nondual Shaiva Tantra called the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, also known in Hindi as the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra. This is an essay I wrote about 9 years ago and just revised a little bit for this recording. And I'm sharing this with you because this summer I will be releasing my first ever meditation app. It's actually much more than a meditation app. It is the first time that a complete scripture of nondual Shaiva Tantra has ever been released in app form. And this means it will contain the complete text of the scripture read by me, as well as 60 or more guided meditations and awareness cultivation techniques drawn from the scripture itself. And this will be unique among all meditation apps because the guided meditations and other practices will not be merely based on the scripture. They will be exactly the techniques taught by the scripture, including details never before presented to the public. So we're very excited about this app, which provisionally will be titled Tantra 112, referring to the 112 techniques of this scripture. So you'll be hearing more about that in the future. And now I present this overview of the text, an essay originally titled, Will the Real Vijñāna-bhairava Please Stand Up? One of the most fascinating, strange, and compelling practice texts in the history of yoga is the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, the scripture of the Bhairava who is consciousness. Bhairava is a proper name for the awe-inspiring aspect of universal consciousness, and is the divine name preferred by non-dual Shaiva Tantrikas of 1,000 years ago. The unusual character of the text is signaled even in the title itself by the unique usage of the name Vijñāna-bhairava, referring to that Bhairava who is not a visualizable deity with specific attributes, but rather is nothing but the awe-inspiring power of expanded awareness itself. The name Consciousness Bhairava is comparable to parallel names from the better-known Buddhist tradition, such as Wisdom Buddha or Medicine Buddha. Vijñāna-bhairava is understood as the deity who mystically revealed the yogic techniques of the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, or VBT. What follows is an introduction to this astonishing 1,200-year-old text, first made famous in the English-speaking world through Osho's The Book of the Secrets, though that book, unfortunately, contains not even a single sentence of accurate translation from the original Sanskrit text. From a literary corpus that once numbered hundreds of scriptural texts, the VBT is the only revealed tantric scripture with a continuous tradition of study in the Valley of Kashmir and elsewhere, all the way down to the present day. Here, scripture refers to a work spoken or alleged to be spoken by Shiva himself, or Shakti herself, the goddess. In other words, as in many other religious traditions, a scripture is thought to be directly revealed by a transcendent divinity. virtually all the other Shaiva Tantric scriptures included highly complex rituals and complex mantra systems, and therefore their study and practice fell away for the most part over centuries of Muslim conquest that destroyed the institutional base that supported such highly ramified developments. This is the primary reason that in 20th century Muslim-dominated Kashmir, the VBT was the only revealed scripture of the Tantric age that was still studied and practiced in full. Now I'll offer an overview of the interesting features of the VBT that make it stand out in the history of yoga. An initial examination of the VBT quickly reveals to the reader that she is here dealing with a text whose ideas and presuppositions about the nature of yogic practice are, in some ways, radically different from those of the classical yoga tradition. The Yoga Sutra of Patañjali, the prototypical text of classical yoga, stresses disengagement with the objects of the senses, and an interiorization so complete that yoga scholar Mircea Eliade, in all seriousness, compared the classical yogi to a vegetable. By contrast, the VBT, written just 4 centuries after the Yoga Sutra, often stresses a dynamic engagement with the sensual world, albeit with a significant shift in awareness or perception regarding the nature of that world. In Yoga Sutra 1.16 we read, "Higher dispassion is a total absence of craving for anything material," suggesting the cultivation of extreme indifference towards the material or sensual world. The VBT, on the other hand, asserts a different perspective, exemplified in the following verses. "Wherever the mind goes, internally or even externally, it discovers nothing but the state of God. Since that state is all-pervasive, where else could the mind go? Wherever and whenever the consciousness of the all-pervasive divinity is manifested through the pathway of the senses, the sense object should be contemplated as having exactly the same nature as that consciousness." In fact, this text goes so far as to recommend absorption in the inner states arising as a direct result of enjoying sense pleasures, including food, drink, sex, and music. Contrary to popular belief, such practices are quite rare in tantric sources, and the popular belief to the contrary is in part due to the influence of the VBT. For example, meditation on sublime music is recommended in verse 73. "The yogin who relishes music and song to the extent that she merges with it and becomes filled with unparalleled happiness, attains heightened awareness, and experiences oneness with the divine." This is a radical departure from the strenuously ascetic earlier tradition, which asserted that involvement with the objects of the senses inevitably drew the practitioner out of the experience of the true self and painfully entangled him with the vicissitudes of worldly life. And I should briefly mention that there's a popular confusion between the words ascetic and aesthetic, which are almost opposites. The first is one who renounces all sensual experience, and the second is one who immerses in the beauty arising from art and sensual experience. However, while illustrating this contrast, it must be stressed that the VBT clearly is not advocating simple self-indulgence, which, as our experience verifies, is no path to fulfillment. Verses 70 and 71, for example, specify that one should become absorbed in the inner feeling of delight triggered by external stimuli, rather than focusing on the stimuli themselves. Thus, the energy of desire, previously seen as a hindrance in sadhana, is redirected towards the attainment of expanded awareness, as per the terms of the later Kulārnava Tantra, which says, quote, "What is called sin becomes a merit when done for a higher purpose," unquote. In this way, the Tantric tradition asserts that desire itself is not a problem, but rather attachment to the belief that desire ought to be fulfilled, and the belief that fulfilling desires is the path to happiness. This wrong view arises in connection with the idea that feelings of joy and happiness are caused by or dependent on the stimuli that catalyzed them. This is demonstrably not the case, since the exact same feelings can arise without any stimuli, and thus the essential problem is one of ignorance, not desire. And if you doubt what I just said at all, I recommend going deeper with the practice of meditation. Another outstanding feature of classical yoga is its fundamental doctrine that the self is attained through the cessation of all mental emotional fluctuations. Yoga Sutra 1.2. In this view, thoughts and emotions, like radio static, mask the pure, sweet, simple melody of the inner self and are therefore useless mental detritus when attempting to realize that self. In contrast, if we were to identify one technique as the most dominant and pervasive theme in the VBT, it might be that of bhavana, a term which encompasses awareness cultivation, creative contemplation, and feeling into what is. In one version of bhavana practice, a profoundly refined thought construct, or shuddha vikalpa, is to be held steadily in awareness. Far from obscuring the state of the self, this allows the mind to relax and savor a nourishing thought that is in alignment with the true nature of reality, until that thought dissolves into a pure feeling state corresponding to the truth of the idea contemplated. This remarkable shift in the nature of meditative practice again indicates the revolutionary nature of the tantric perspective exemplified by this scripture. Examples of this kind of bhavana are rife throughout the text. In verses 63 and 65, the aspirant contemplates her body and then the whole universe as having the nature of joyful awareness. In verse 109, one contemplates, quote, "Since I have all the attributes of Shiva, I am the same as the highest divinity," unquote. In verse 110, one meditates on the idea that, quote, "The energy waves of the universe arise in their various forms from me, Bhairava," unquote. These creative contemplations are not only a methodological innovation over the earlier tradition, but also clearly assert a doctrinal difference, that of non-duality over and against duality. The duality of the earlier classical tradition, of course, was not one of difference between oneself and pure consciousness, but rather an ontological distinction between that consciousness and the material world. But the Yoga Sutra also teaches that the soul is ontologically distinct from God, though identical in essence. These are dualities which the VBT blithely disregards, encouraging the practitioner to see divine consciousness pulsating in the entire manifest world, as well as in and as her own body, mind, and spirit. And if the examples given haven't yet convinced you of the great gulf that separates the Yoga Sutra and the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, I advise you to read the scripture in its entirety, and you'll see that the entire orientation is quite different. Astonishingly, the VBT is one of the earliest non-dual practice texts to appear in the historical record. Yet it exhibits remarkable maturity and sophistication of thought, and it teaches detailed and subtle practices. Its non-dual attitude culminates in its penultimate contemplative practice, a verse which confidently proclaims that all knowable phenomena should be contemplated as consisting of one consciousness. Note, the Yoga Sutra is often misunderstood to be teaching methods by which the practitioner becomes one with that which he meditates upon. But in fact, the text teaches that the mind of the practitioner fuses with the object of meditation, and the mind is explicitly distinct from the self in that text and wholly irreconcilable with it, which is not the case in the Tantric teaching. Continuity of the tradition with earlier forms. Having described the contrasts between the classical and tantric yogas, I must now go back and nuance my simplifications. A peculiar feature of South Asian religion is its reluctance to repudiate earlier strata of the tradition. At the very least, respectful lip service is paid to past masters, and more usually their teachings and practices are retained insofar as they can fit into the new system, even if they must be reinterpreted. Thus we see the apparently atavistic survival of a Patanjalian view in the VBT, as in these verses. Wherever the mind goes, in that very instant let it abandon whatever it has alighted upon. Due to having nothing to hang on to, it then becomes waveless, i.e., free of fluctuation or agitation. Observing a desire suddenly arising, one should lead it to quiescence. It will dissolve into the very place from which it arose. A number of other verses recommend blocking off the senses or introverting awareness, as well as dissolving all thought constructs. However, I said the survival of these elements is only apparently atavistic, and this is because the text presupposes a methodological theory that reconciles the apparently contradictory approaches. This is the theory of upaya, often translated as skillful means, or more colloquially, do what works. According to this theory, a variety of techniques ought to be presented, both introversive and extroversive, thoughtful and thought-free, sensual and renunciatory, because of the differences in aptitude and inclination in the variety of practitioners who might use the text. Verse 148 discusses the great benefit of being established in even one of the methods described here. Clearly, then, the practitioner is not expected to pursue all, or even a majority of the techniques described in the text, but rather to choose those few which work most effectively for him or her, and pursue them assiduously to actualize the promised, quote, absolute wholeness, nourished fullness, and deep contentment. Verse 148. If we assume that the text was in fact intended as a teaching manual for gurus, not a practice manual for aspirants, as is likely, then the diversity of techniques becomes even less problematic. The guru or acharya, relying on the intuition that, quote, arises through intensity of devotion in one who is dispassionate about everything but truth, would select those yuktis, or techniques, from the text that are appropriate to the adhikara, the understanding, aptitude, and readiness of the individual student. This might include assigning techniques which are not those preferred by the student, because the teacher can see what they need as opposed to what they want. And this, of course, is one of the more significant pitfalls of not having a teacher. In this context, we should not consider the survival of some Patanjalian methods in tantric contexts to be unusual, because for some students, those methods will be precisely what they need. Not only do the various strands of the yogic tradition coexist in the VBT, sometimes they syncretistically merge in a manner that indicates a thoughtful dialectic on the part of the anonymous author or authors. A good example is verse 94. Contemplate thus. There is no mental apparatus within me, consisting of the mind, ego, and so on. Through the absence of mental constructs of selfhood based on ephemeral mental operations, one becomes free of such constructs and will abide as pure awareness. Here we see an almost paradoxical reconciliation of classical yogic practice with the later tantric tool of bhavana. For the aspirant is to use the mind to contemplate the mind's non-existence. And this, by the way, does not constitute a denial of the existence of thought, but rather a denial of the existence of the mind as an entity, a noun, rather than a verb, a process. And this is significant because when we reify the mind, we essentialize it, we attribute qualities to it. We believe that we have such and such a kind of mind, and this belief undermines the awakening process. The instruction to have the mind contemplate its own non-existence is clearly intended to cause a Zen-like short circuit of one's identification with the mind, resulting, for one who has the aptitude, in the pure awareness described. This is a good example of the pragmatic experimentalism of the text, which benefited from the great diversity of possible methods in the age of classical Tantra. And I should note, many of these unique and fascinating techniques were subsequently forgotten as the tradition contracted under the later Muslim conquests. And this is why we look back to the so-called classical period before 1200 to discover the richest array of practices to support our spiritual process. Sectarian affiliation. The VBT has an explicit affiliation with a specific tantric lineage, a fact obscured by almost all of its translators. It teaches a form of the Trika, in which a single deity, Paradevi, the supreme goddess, is venerated as Bhairavi, the consort of Bhairava. Thus, the text also has a Kaula affiliation, since it is the Kaula tradition that worships the consort pair of Bhairava and Bhairavi. So we can therefore confidently say this is a text of the Kaula Trika. However, in this scripture, both these names, Bhairava and Bhairavi, are used to refer to states of expanded consciousness or inner fullness, with Bhairavi being used more for states resulting from an activation of energy, or Shakti, and the name Bhairava being used for states of stillness and open spaciousness and quiescence. The VBT seems to exhibit a strong Buddhist influence, for one of its most common themes is meditating on the voidness or emptiness of things, shunyata. For example, the inside of the body is contemplated as empty space, the senses as voids, and the whole universe as pure, expansive voidness. Yet this apparent Buddhist influence is not a form of syncretism, for the scripture maintains throughout a theology of Shiva Shakti, where Shiva is defined as unbounded spacious awareness, or aware spaciousness, and Shakti as various forms of energy that are intrinsic to and vitalize that awareness. One can be a means of accessing the other, for they are inseparable, like fire and its heat. But the primary teaching of the text is that we access the non-conceptual space of Shiva, or unconditioned awareness, through the energy that is Shakti. Despite the text's strong goddess orientation, ultimately the goal it presents is one of abiding in the pure, spacious, open, still, silent ground of being that is named as Shiva or Bhairava. The VBT frequently stresses that the state it seeks is utterly free of any mental constructs, even if a mental construct was used to get there. The text repeatedly articulates a goal of accessing the natural state of awareness that results from dissolving all thought constructs and feelings into their source and ground. Unusual or atypical techniques easily integrated with everyday life. I have already mentioned the fact that the text teaches or alludes to specific esoteric techniques of inner yoga which require an expert's explanation to perform correctly. But the VBT also teaches unique and unconventional techniques for entering into the expanded and intensified state of awareness, techniques that are not traditionally considered yogic, except in lineages of nondual Shaiva Tantra. These techniques include gazing at a blank wall, a vast open space, or the clear blue sky, and letting awareness become likewise open and clear. Attending to the space between thoughts, without inhibiting the flow of thought. Meditating on the liminal state between waking and sleeping. Gazing at a pattern of sunlight filtering through the leaves of a tree or lattice window and becoming absorbed in its silent play. Contemplating that the sky is in your head. Quietly repeating the vowel ah, or contemplating a single musical note arising from and merging back into silence. Accessing intensified awareness through the pain of a bodily piercing. Spinning around and falling down, or walking for miles until exhausted. And simply sitting and doing nothing. Many of the above techniques invite the practitioner into nirvikalpa states, that is, states which are largely or entirely free of thought constructs and mental chatter, but they teach how to access those states much more easefully. Some of the teachings of this peculiar scripture cannot even be called techniques. Rather, the text invites us to notice daily life opportunities for accessing the awareness of our innate being that we might otherwise let slip by. These practices are even more unusual to find in a Sanskrit scripture. For example, we are invited to immerse ourselves in the feeling of wonder from watching a magic show, the aftermath of an orgasm, the arising of inner delight when savoring fine food and drink, listening to the vibration of live instrumental music or becoming one with the joyous feeling of a song, the repetitive, gentle rocking motion of a swing or carriage, what we find when we follow intense emotions back to their source and ground, and the energy of sharpened and heightened awareness in any intense experience. Though this scripture was atypical, it was also seminal, for it laid the groundwork for a Gnostic version of Tantric Yoga, in which traditional ritual could be overcoded with Gnostic meaning or dispensed with altogether for those with sufficiently high adhikara, aptitude, and qualification. Thus, we must be clear that this text was aimed at those who had already learned Tantric ritual and the more basic forms of yoga. This is proven by verses 144 through 151, which would not be meaningful for anyone who was not familiar with the rituals mentioned and reinterpreted in those crucial closing verses. Existing translations of the VBT. Today, there are at least a dozen published translations of the VBT, whereas the vast majority of the tantric scriptural corpus remains untranslated. It would be more accurate to say that there have been at least a dozen attempts to translate the VBT, none of which have been very successful for reasons we will come to. These translations range from Jaidev Singh's mostly accurate but inaccessible version to Lauren Roach's poetic rendering entitled The Radiant Sūtras, a version that has almost no connection to the specific techniques of the original text. In between these two extremes, we have a very mixed bag, including the Bihar school's disappointing translation, let down by the author's poor grasp of Sanskrit syntax, and Dmitry Semenov's little-known but surprisingly good attempt at a practitioner-friendly translation, which, despite its many mistakes, demonstrates that the author has had considerable success in practicing the scripture's subtle techniques. We also have Osho's famous version, the Book of the Secrets, which, contrary to the belief of his many devotees, is not based on the original Sanskrit scripture at all, but rather on Paul Repp's 1957 poetic rendering, which makes no attempt to capture any of the yogic practices or specificity of the original. Osho presented Repp's words as if they were those of the original scripture, which he apparently never even consulted. Repp's influenced Daniel Odier and Lauren Roach as well, and though he was a fine poet, one cannot hope to retrieve the original practices from his version. We also have a couple of published translations that purport to be by Swami Lakshmanju, the last living guru of the Trika in Kashmir. But in fact, Swamiji never wrote a translation. Rather, he gave extemporaneous explanations of the text's practices, explanations which are often very helpful, but also often somewhat vague, and exhibit occasional misunderstandings when it comes to the more technical yogic practices of the text. So, to set the record straight on this point, if you have purchased a translation attributed to Lakshmanju, published by Indica Press, that is in fact Bettina Boehmer's translation, followed by Lakshmanju's extemporaneous, orally delivered explanation of the verse in question. In her translation, Boehmer had to do a balancing act between the literal meaning of the Sanskrit and the way Lakshmanju was interpreting it, and the result is sometimes problematic, though certainly contributes some value. Though Jaidev Singh is the only published translator who bothered to study the Sanskrit commentaries on the text and factor them into his translation is not accessible to 21st century practitioners because even though he understands well the practice being described in at least 80% of the verses, in my rough estimation, he usually does not express himself in a form of English that a modern reader can use to accurately practice the technique given. Additionally, like Lakshmanju, he tries to force the text to fit into the schema of Abhinavagupta's 3 upayas, a schema certainly unknown to the VBT's author. So we're left with the amazing fact that despite the enormous interest worldwide in Tantra and Tantric Yoga, we don't have a single fully accurate and fully accessible translation of the only Shaiva Tantric Yoga scripture to survive the ravages of time as a living document linked to communities of practice. This is why I've spent the last 10 years refining my translation of this extraordinary text. Now let me add a few comments here, because some people don't like it when I say anything negative about other people's work, which they have obviously put a lot of time and care into as well. And I want to be crystal clear. many of the existing translations of the VBT do contribute value. People can read those translations, which exist in multiple languages other than English, and they can get some good understanding of what the text is teaching and what its orientation is. The only issue I wish to highlight here is that many of the practices taught in the VBT cannot be understood on the basis of that text alone. They require wide reading in Shaiva Tantric sources to understand what's being hinted at in these fairly terse verses of the VBT. So my main point is that the existing translations often do not equip the reader to perform the practice in question correctly. And in order to present accurate practice teachings on all of the 112 yuktis of the VBT, I've had to look at the Sanskrit commentaries as well as looking at many parallel sources that teach these practices, or practices similar to them. Just to give the most obvious example, verse 77 of the VBT names 5 specific practices, but gives no information about what those practices are or how to do them. So these are in fact the 5 krama mudras, very important esoteric practices of the krama lineage that are extremely powerful. So I researched these in multiple other sources in order to be able to teach the practice correctly. And there are many other verses of the VBT that merely allude to a practice without giving any of its details, such as the practice of Deha Shuddhi or Bhuta Shuddhi, and many others. So the job of the scholar is to attempt to ascertain exactly what practice the original author or authors had in mind when composing these verses, and that's what I've attempted to do. Of course, as a practitioner, I have tested my understanding in practice of most of these techniques, which has assisted the translation, which nonetheless remains rigorously philological, that is to say, based in a very close study of the language of the text and parallel sources from the same time period. And as far as I can tell, none of the other translators of the text have undergone this thorough of a process in their translation effort. In fact, I first began studying the VBT 25 years ago. And though there are a handful of verses that I still might not understand perfectly, I am confident, finally, in presenting my translation. Many people were hoping for the publication of a print book presenting that translation and my commentary, but I decided instead to make an audio book so that I could actually offer guided meditations. And then the idea shifted, instead of an audio book, to create an app which is much more user-friendly than an audiobook when presenting 60 or more guided meditative practices. In app format, one can organize the material in a variety of different ways, thematically, by level of difficulty, and in many other interesting ways. And the presentation of the practices and the text in this more fluid and modular format where everything is clearly laid out visually, and yet one can do guided meditations in audio form, seems to be ideal as a medium for sharing this particular tantric scripture. So I'm happy to say that the app presenting the entirety of the VBT, the first time an app has presented an entire tantric scripture, will be available later this year. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.